All right. As Matt said, my name is Jim Hopf. I'm a member of the Generation Atomic government team, and I'm here today to talk about writing letters to the editor that are both effective and likely to be published. Specifically, I'm going to go over why it's important to send letters to the editor, how to best select news articles or editorials or stuff, news content that your letter would be in response to, some ideal content for your letter, other actions that you'll also need to do in order to get your letter to the editor published. This is kind of logistical stuff. And then finally, at the end, I'm going to go over some useful tools that will help you find opportunities for letters, like where to find the articles to respond to and things like that. Okay, so why is it important to write letters to the editor? First of all, it lets the public and legislators know that nuclear is an important topic that people in the community care about. But even more importantly, it lets the public and legislators know that there are people in the community who support nuclear, and I can't emphasize this enough. Up until recently, and maybe still now, legislators and the public in general, they have this impression that most of the public is against nuclear. And that has ramifications, like, when a legislator is deciding whether to support a bill that's pro-nuclear or even vote for a bill that's anti-nuclear, they have this impression that most of their constituents are anti-nuclear. And, these groups are very active. They hear from them a lot. So they have that impression. So they might make a decision in the anti-nuclear direction because they think it's good politics. They think they will suffer political consequences if they support nuclear. So again, if they hear from people, whether it's, pro-nuclear lobby meetings or letters to the editor, that shows them that no, there's a large and growing fraction of the population is supportive of nuclear. If your letter is in response to an article that's about a specific issue or legislation, letters that mention legislators by name are likely to get the legislators' attention. A lot of these legislative offices, they have staff that monitor the local newspaper, see what they're writing about and whatever. If they come across a letter to the editor that actually mentions the legislator by name, they may flag that, and bring it to the legislator's attention, which improves your odds of having your letter have an impact on that legislator. And one final thing, even if your letter doesn't get published, the effort was still not in vain. It still shows the newspaper that there is support for nuclear in the community, and that'll increase the likelihood in the future of them publishing pro-nuclear letters, whether it's your own letter or whether it's a letter from somebody else. Okay, next is selecting the news content to respond to. Once again, newspapers don't publish letters unless they're in response to some form of content that was published in their paper. An out of the blue letter that I just want to talk about this topic and here's a letter that I want you to publish. Almost certainly those letters don't get published. It has to be in response to something. Another issue is topic selection. You want to select, ideally, an article that is about nuclear, it's relevant to nuclear, and comment on that. That said, however, it's often true. I mean, lately, in recent years, nuclear has been receiving more attention, but in years past, it would be hard, you'd go for a long time where there isn't an article about nuclear power, specifically about nuclear power, that you can respond to. So one key skill that nuclear letter writers had is to find an article that isn't exactly about nuclear power, but they could respond to that article and segue, the narrative to the pro-nuclear talking points that they want to make. And I'm going to talk about this in a later slide. And finally, you want to respond to an article or an issue that the newspaper itself thinks is newsworthy. If they think it's an important topic, they're more likely to publish your letter. They actually have what's called a newsworthiness hierarchy. At the top are the things that if you write a letter in response to things near the top, you're more likely to be published, and conversely, on the bottom, you're less likely to be published. Like if you write a letter in response to one of their own editorials, or perhaps a story that's on the front page, an important news story, more likely to publish it. They also like responses to staff written columns. In other words, by the newspaper's own staff, that as opposed to a syndicated columnist. A locally written op-ed is a good thing to respond to. You know, further down is a syndicated columnist. Stories that are somewhat less important, they were buried inside the paper, an editorial cartoon. And yes, writing in response to someone else's letter is apparently the least likely to get published. So you should keep that in mind. Now we're going to move on to the content of the letter that will increase the likelihood of it getting published and being effective. First thing, very early in your letter, ideally in the first sentence, you want to reference the story that you're responding to. In other words, give the date of when it appeared in that newspaper and the page that it appeared on. Basically, not only the readers, but also the staff at the newspaper, it helps direct them. It's like, oh, this letter is in response to this, and it helps them find that. Also, if you can, consider working in a compliment for the writer of the article or for the paper itself. You know, they're only human. If you give them a nice warm compliment, they're frankly more likely to publish your letter. Here are some examples. The Mercury News is right to advocate passage of SB 32, parenthesis, August 21 editorial. So it's telling them I'm responding to your August 21 editorial, and I'm giving you a compliment about what you said. Here's another example. In terms of whether nuclear or fossil fuels carry more risk, page 1A, the answer is obvious. You know, that would be a good first sentence for a letter. Now, it's a little bit more indirect in terms of the compliment. What I'm basically saying is, that's a great question you asked. Here's my answer. And by the way, I'm referring to an article that appeared on page 1 on whatever that date is. Okay, now I'm going to also talk about the issue I was talking about in the last slide. Sometimes there's a dearth of specifically nuclear articles to respond to, so you might need to get creative. An important skill is to transition from one story to another. Like, let me give an example. Wildfires have been a huge issue for many years now. Lots of news stories about them, often on the front page. So you'd love to respond to that letter, to get your letter published, respond to that article, but it's about wildfires. So what do? Well, a skilled writer would say, okay, you know, in my first sentence, I'm going to refer to the wildfire article and say something about wildfires, but then I'm going to point out that global warming is thought to increase both the frequency and the severity of wildfires. And then finally, you'll move on to your nuclear talking points. You know, nuclear will help with global warming, and that will help with wildfires. But it allowed you to start your letter saying, I'm responding to this story about wildfires. So that's a skill that you might need to employ. Another thing that helps a letter get published and also makes the letter more effective is that it's better if you identify a solution to an issue, and maybe better yet, have a specific call to action. That, as opposed to writing a letter that just bitches, you know, about this horrible problem without offering solutions. You know, a lot of letters are like that way, and you hear that a lot. If you're actually proposing a solution, I think the readers would appreciate it more, and it'll probably be more likely to get published. And finally, in the last two bullets, you know, these are just things, you know, if you're a skilled writer, a good storyteller, these are things that might make your letter more enjoyable. It might draw in more eyes. Maybe it'll improve the chance of it getting published and read. Like, if in the first sentence or two, if you can have like a creative hook or some interesting story that would draw the readers in, that's great. If you can employ some metaphors, some, you know, comic wit or some plays on words, that would make your article more colorful if possible. But I'll be honest with you, in most circumstances, your opportunity to do that is limited. Okay, furthermore, in terms of the content of your letter, you always need to be respectful. You know, avoid ad hominem attacks, avoid attacking or demonize certain individuals or groups. And, you know, in some cases, this can be a struggle for us, you know, nuclear advocates. Like, we always feel an urge to say negative things about renewables, or, you know, policies we didn't like the old Green New Deal. You know, there's always going to be an urge to do that. Only raise those divisive issues if it's absolutely necessary. And if you do, you need to be very careful about it and do it in a very polite way. You know, you need to avoid negative language if you can. Try to spin it positive. Like, let me give you a specific example. Instead of saying, you know, renewables are awful because they create very few jobs, instead you would say something more positive. You know, you characterize it in a positive way. Nuclear is great because it creates a large number of high-paying jobs, and you might even squeeze in the phrase, more so than other alternatives. That's kind of a better way of saying the same thing. If your letter is about a specific issue, or better yet, a specific piece of legislation, as I mentioned earlier, mention the local legislators by name. For example, I urge Representative what's his name, to support this specific bill. As I discussed earlier, it's likely to get the legislators' attention. Their staff might be monitoring letters to the editor of the paper, and a flag will go up if their name is specifically mentioned. Such LTEs that are about a certain bill that make reference to a certain legislator, they'll be especially effective if your letter is in line with that legislator's basic values. Like, if you have a liberal focused letter and you name a conservative by name, your letter might be a little bit less effective. But if your letter is making conservative talking points like jobs and the economy as a reason for nuclear, then if you mention that legislator, they might have a good chance of reacting positively. There are a few key words and concepts that we've learned to use. These are just general things. Certain words are more appealing to progressives, some are more appealing to conservatives. If you're trying to attract conservatives as your audience, use words like free enterprise, not having market distortions, accountability, liberty, and job creation. If you're trying to attract or get the support of progressives, use general words like the environment, social justice, and fairness, things like that. Okay. Moving on from the content of your letter, here are some other things that you should do in order to get your letter published. One first thing is, it's a piece of general advice. Before submitting a letter to the editor on a certain paper, take a look at the paper, look at the letters section, look at the letters that have been successfully published in that paper. I'm not talking about anything specific, but you'll just get a feel for the style and the format and the content of those letters. Here's an example of letters that got published. So it's just something to keep in the back of your mind to think about when you're writing your own letter. Okay, now let's move on to more specific things you need to pay attention to. You need to look up and read the guidelines that the paper has for letter to the editor submissions. Maximum word length being the key, the most important one of all. Usually they have maximum allowable words of somewhere between 125 and 250 words. And believe me, it's a monumental challenge. It's by far the biggest challenge I face. It's very hard to do. You have all these things you want to say, all these arguments you want to make. The real truth is that if you have more than one assertion to make in your letter, you're literally only going to have enough space to basically state those assertions. You're not really going to have any time, any space to provide backup arguments, or data or facts that support the assertion. So if you have multiple assertions, you're probably just going to be able to make the assertions and that's it. If you maybe have only one assertions, there might be room for a few facts and arguments that provide support for that assertion. More specifically, just in terms of logistics, when you send your letter to the editor, I'm not talking about the content of your letter. I'm talking about what you submit to them, be it an email or on an online form. They want you to provide information about yourself. Generally, they're going to require that you give them your name and address, sometimes even your phone number. And one final thing, in the communication you send to the paper, a question you have is whether you want to claim affiliation with some other organization. Like, for instance, do you want to say, I'm writing on behalf of Generation Atomic, or I'm a member of Generation Atomic? In some instances, that might help you get published. In other instances, you might want to appear independent. You might just want to go as you, the individual. Also, I'm not talking about the requirements for the letter itself, but they have requirements, for your submission. Look up the details for how to submit a letter for that newspaper. Usually it's in the form of either an online submission form. It has a bunch of fields that you fill in for your personal information, and then there's a big box for you to give your letter to the editor content. But more often, they just give you an email address, and they want you to send them an email. So If you do send an email, it's very helpful to refer to the story that you're responding to, literally right in the email's title, and also include the article's date and the page number that it appeared now on the paper. You know, it appeared in this paper on this date, on this page number. And again, maybe the title itself. For example, here's a title for the email you send them. You know, you're sending them an email that's going to include the body of your letter, right in the title line of your email, letter to the editor in response to the May 11th, page 3 story that was either about this issue or literally had the title of, you know, XXXX. That's what you should have in your email's title line. One final thing to point out is that many newspapers limit the frequency from a given letter writer that they will publish a letter from them. Usually it's once a month. So, you know, the point there is simply if you got a letter published in that paper in a given month, there's no point in trying to do it again in the same month. Just wait till the next month before you try again. Okay, we're going to have a couple examples here. I'm not going to read them out loud. As Matt said, this presentation is going to be stored and published. So, you know, you can maybe just read these example articles at your leisure if you just pull up the presentation. Instead, I'm just going to talk about some of the key features that these example letters have. Like in the first paragraph, I should mention, you know, we're going to have an example that's basically the same letter, one tailored to a progressive audience and one tailored to a conservative audience. So the beginning and ends of the two letters are actually the same. At the first paragraph, what it did is, you know, we worked in a complement for the article writer. We gave the page number and date of the article responding to when it appeared in the paper. And the last paragraph, we identified a politician. In this case, it was the governor of Illinois. And it had a specific call to action, which was to pass the Clean Energy Jobs Act. By the way, these letters were written several years ago. There was an effort to keep the Illinois plants open. And they were talking about a state bill that would keep the plants open. And that was a successful effort on our part. That law did pass. The plants did stay open. So forgive it for being a little bit out of date. Now, the two letters are only different in the middle, and that's the part where you give your supporting arguments, you know, why nuclear is good and so on and so forth. In the progressive letter, it focuses entirely on climate change. It talks about how, you know, in terms of climate, the state would be set way back, you know, if these huge nuclear plants close. And there's also an admonition that renewables should be used to replace fossil fuels instead of having them replace other non-emitting sources like nuclear. So that's kind of like your central argument. That'll be different for progressives or if you're trying to reach out to conservatives. But the top and the bottom are basically the same. Here's the example letter for conservatives. And again, only the middle is different. The only difference is instead of talking about climate change, it talks strictly about the economics of nuclear power, the economic benefits of nuclear power, and more specifically, what would happen to the local communities economically if those plants were to close. You know, they would lose a massive number of high-paying jobs. They would lose most of their local tax base, and so on and so forth. You know, that instead of the climate change argument. There is one interesting wrinkle about this article, and that is it has a sentence that says, you know, gas and renewable generators employ far fewer workers and those jobs are non-union, yada, yada. Okay, you may remember earlier I said that we need to be very careful about, you know, bashing renewables or, you know, using negative comments. And this is an example where the writer is challenged with that question, you know, to what extent do I want to be negative about the competition? And you know, my opinion is I think it was probably called for in this specific article's case. But even then, you know, I could probably dream up more positive and more polite ways of doing it. Like, you know, in other words, instead of saying that gas and renewable generators are bad because they have, you know, a low number of jobs, low paying non-union, you would put it in a positive way. Like you would say, nuclear provides a large number of unionized high paying jobs. And you might squeeze in, you know, to a greater extent than the alternatives that would replace it. I mean, you're kind of saying the same thing, but you're saying it in a more polite way. Okay. Now, we have like 4 other example letters. These are just that you can maybe peruse them later. These first 2, again, one for a progressive audience, one for a conservative audience, they're very similar to the Illinois ones that I talked about earlier. The only difference is that they're talking about a federal policy. They're urging the Biden administration to do something federally to keep existing nuclear plants open until a more comprehensive climate and energy policy is passed. Again, these articles were from a few years ago. It's been overtaken by events. That comprehensive policy was passed. It's called the Inflation Reduction Act, and the IRA has features that will keep existing nuclear plants open. So that issue is kind of on the federal level has kind of gone away. Again, apologies for these examples being a little bit out of date. I have another example. This is one of mine, identifying a citizens climate lobby. I wrote this letter, which got published, about the merits of carbon pricing. Okay, again, this is just another example for you to peruse. Here's another one that got published. He talks about waste, and he also talks about supporting the Nuclear Energy Leadership Act. Again, it's a specific call to action. Another letter in here, in case you're interested, another letter that got published. Okay, I want to finish up by talking about one more topic, and that is tools that may help you find articles to reply to. It'd be annoying if you had to like read all the newspapers in your local area, read them every day to try and find nuclear related articles that you can reply to. That would be a pretty big hassle. Fortunately, there are tools that will do the job for you. There's this thing called a Google alert. And if you just type Google alert into your browser, this URL here shown in purple will probably come up. I think it's the first thing that comes up. If you click on that URL, now shown in purple at the top of this page, it'll bring up the utility. And the first thing you'll see is this is mine. It shows me the Google alerts that I already have for 3 papers. And in the top thing, it has how to create a new one. Now, when you do this for the first time, those 3 things in the middle of the page, they're not going to be there because you don't have anything set up yet. So you'll have to fill out what's in the top line there. Create an alert about, it says. And what you put in that line is something that looks like this. If you look to the top of this page, you'll see what's in the top box. There's this long URL, site https www.mercurynews.com. That is the Mercury News' website, okay? You follow that with a slash, and then you put 1 or more keywords in parentheses, and then you have an or between them. And what you're doing is you're telling the utility every day, look at the Mercury News, scan all of its articles, and identify articles that were in the Mercury News that day that mention either the word nuclear or global warming. And then what it will do is it'll, in your email box, will show these notifications that said, here are all the articles about nuclear that contain those specific keywords that were published in your local papers today. It'll do it for all the papers you specify. Like, for instance, I've got 3 here. It'll look at all 3 for that day, and it'll say, here are all the articles that day that mentioned one of those 2 keywords. Actually, some of the pages kind of shows what you get. They're giving you, here's the content. In bold, they highlight the keyword, that you specified. And finally, you'll see this last page. The most important thing is the bottom. You have to, give your email address somewhere. That's where you do it. And there are some other preference, pull downs on the same page. So again, look these 4 slides over at your leisure. If you pull up the presentation again, if anyone has a question about how this works, if you're having trouble, maybe send me to my email or something, get in contact with me. I'll try to help you out. It is pretty straightforward. And again, the beauty of it is all you have to do is look at your email inbox, and you'll have a set of articles that were published in the local papers that day that are about nuclear or climate. And that's your list of articles that you can consider writing a response to. It greatly reduces your labor. And one final topic I want to talk about is there are other things you can do, not to, help content to respond to, but it's kind of for your general education. It lets you know about nuclear news, what's happening in the nuclear industry kind of across the country. It publishes, things on policy, climate energy policies that affect nuclear, and policies about nuclear specifically. It also tells you about, these sites will tell you about bills that are being considered, so that, that's an important arsenal of information for you to have when you decide what to write about, what your talking abouts will be. Some of these things, they're called a nuclear aggregator. Some of these sites, like Nuclear Town Hall, it's simply a website. All you have to do every morning or whatever is just type Nuclear Town Hall into your browser. You'll be taken to the site, and they will show you all the articles of the day that they consider important. Other sites like NEI Smart Brief, what you have to do is, it doesn't cost any money, but you have to sign up for something. You have to sign up for the Smart Brief, and once you do, in your email inbox every day, you will say, here's today's Nuclear Smart Brief. When you click on that, you'll get a set of like 6 or 7 articles that they decided to talk about that day. Again, for your own education, for your own interest, it provides topics to talk about.